Hello there, and welcome back to the final week of the Upscale Plaid Quilt Along. This is week 4 of our quilt along. If you are just now joining us, be sure to go back and watch weeks 1, 2, and 3 before you watch this week. My name is Brittany Lloyd of Lo and Behold Stitchery, and let's get started. This week we are creating our quilt top, which means that we are sewing all of our quadrant rows together, and then we're going to sew our quadrants together, and then we'll be done. So this has been so much fun. If you've been following along, I'm so excited to wrap up this quilt along with you. By this point, you should know which layout you are making. So Upscale Plaid has 5 different layouts. You should have your layout already picked out. We did that last week. And because we have already decided on our layout, we pressed our seams in these rows so that they are going to nest whenever we sew them together. So first and foremost, we are going to sew our rows together, and then that is going to create our quadrants. You are going to have nesting seams for this process, but just like the previous weeks, I like to use some glue just to really get those points that I really care about aligned. And then I also use pins with that, and then the nesting seams help everything stay together as well. Okay, so referring to step 3 under the quilt top assembly section, we are going to sew all of our rows together shown just like the diagram. For the coaster, placemat, and pillow, we are going to press these row seams open. And for the lap, throw, queen, and king, we are going to make all 4 of our quadrants and then press the row seams according to our seam pressing chart. So I have my first row and my second row here. And since I am making the layout 1, I have 2 of my row 1 seams pressed to the right, and then I have 2 of my row 1 seams pressed to the left. And the same goes for this. So whenever I go to pin these 2 seams right sides together, I want to make sure that I'm picking up a row that is pressed in the opposite direction as what I'm pinning it to. So for example, this row, my seams are pressed to the right, and this row, my seams are pressed to the right. So I'm going to grab a row 2 where my seams are pressed to the left, and then that is going to give me nesting seams. Whenever our seams are going the opposite direction, they're just going to lay a little bit flatter, and it also helps you keep things aligned whenever you are pinning and sewing. And so that is the beauty of this chart, is to really help you get those nesting seams so that you don't have any issues whenever it comes to bulkiness of your seams, and also helping to keep things aligned. So now I'm going to pin these 2 pieces right sides together. These seams are pressed to one side, they are nesting, and then I have these seams that are pressed open. So because I have these seams that are pressed open, I'm going to use glue again. This is optional. You are welcome to just use pins if you would like, but I like to do just a little bit of glue, just like I did in the previous weeks, just to really get those seams aligned. And then I will also be using this nesting seam right here, really making sure that this seam is aligned as well. So I'm going to do a combination of glue and pins, and I'm just going to get everything in place, and then I will move on to my next 2 rows. Again, assessing those seams, making sure that I'm lining up 2 rows that have the seams pressed in the opposite direction. This is a really long seam, so I definitely recommend pins. Even though we have nesting seams, it's always just really nice to make sure that things stay aligned as you are sewing so that nothing shifts. All right, I'm going to set this off to the side. I'm going to chain piece that in just a second. Then I'm going to grab my next piece. So these seams are going this way. Let's see, these seams are going this way. Since they're opposite, those are going to work beautifully together. Now I'm going to go and chain piece these seams. Okay, so now I have my row 2 sewn together with my row 1. I need to press this seam, so I'm going to refer to my seam pressing chart. I'm making layout 1. I want to make sure that I follow the correct row all the way across to see which rows within my quadrants need to be pressed up and which rows need to be pressed down, because for layouts 1 and 5, 2 quadrant row seams are getting pressed up, 2 quadrant row seams are getting pressed down. So what I'm going to do is refer to my first row, and I pressed those seams to the left. My second row, I press those seams to the right. So that means I'm looking at that top row and going all the way across, I need to press my row seams up. So take a look at that. Make sure that you fully understand which seams need to be pressed up, which seams need to be pressed down. This is going to give us nesting seams whenever we go to sew our quadrants together for the various layouts that we are making. So it's all going to be a little bit different based on which layout you are making. So be sure to look carefully at that. So what that means, I'm actually going to flip this over like this. I'm going to set my seam and then lift up, and from the right side, press my seam up. So I'm making sure that my seam is flipped up underneath, and then pressing my fabric, really getting the nose of my iron in that seam. I don't want there to be a huge fold around the seam. There is going to be a little bit. That's just the nature of pressing your seams to one side. So now I left off here. So I'm going to do the same for this section. So basically whatever direction I am pressing my seam, so if I'm pressing my seam up towards my row 1, then I'm going to have my row 1 piece on top, so that whenever I flip it over, my seam should be positioned underneath my piece, and I should just be able to go back through pressing my seam like this. You can use steam if you would like. You can use a tailor's clapper if you would like. Okay, so here is my first set of row 1 and row 2. Now I'm going to keep pressing my seams according to the seam pressing chart. Then I'm going to go back through and sew all of my row 3s to this edge, making sure that I grab the correct row 3 to give me nesting seams. So this row 2 seams are pressed to the right. I want to make sure that I grab a row 3 with seams that are pressed to the left for this particular piece. For this quadrant, I'm going to press that seam up as well. So all of my seams in this quadrant are going to be going up, and I'm just going to repeat this process until I have all 4 of my quadrants made. Whenever you go to pin your pieces together, you want to make sure that your piece is also aligned along the perpendicular edge. You really want your piece to be square and straight on the bottom piece. So really pay attention to that. Make sure that you are pinning and that it's staying square, and that as you're sewing this seam, that your piece isn't getting stretched along this edge. We really want this top piece to be aligned up here and also down here as we are sewing this seam, and that is going to help us ensure that this edge is straight whenever we go to press this seam. And then once you have all of your row seams sewn together, your quadrants are officially created, then it's time to move on to step 4 under quilt top assembly. So this is basically just arranging your quadrants according to the layout that you're making. Note that for some of the layouts, you might have to switch up your quadrants in order to create nesting seams. So once you've laid out your quadrants on either a tabletop or the floor or a bed, or if you have a design wall, however you are laying out your quadrants, double check that those seams in between the rows nest because they should be opposite of each other. And if you notice that they aren't, then you might need to swap the quadrants diagonally. So sometimes that can happen depending on what layout you're making, but double check before you start sewing that your seams from row to row between the quadrants are opposite. You might need to square up your quadrants just a little bit before you go to sew them together. In a perfect world, you do not need to square anything up. All of your edges should be perfectly aligned, but sometimes it happens you have just a little tiny sliver that can be trimmed off, and that's going to help you align your quadrants a little bit better whenever you go to sew them together. I want to preface, you do not want to be doing any large amount of trimming. If you're trimming away lots of fabric, anything larger than just a teeny tiny little sliver, that's going to affect how your quadrants fit together. So you really shouldn't be trimming off anything at all. But right here, you can see where my green piece extends just a little bit past this piece that I sewed it to. So if I take my ruler and align this piece and this piece up here, I can trim off just a teeny tiny bit of green fabric. That's not very much, and that's good. I don't want to trim off too much. I don't want to affect the overall size of my quadrant because I want everything to fit together nicely when I go to sew it together. Now, if you do have any pieces that are really sticking out and not even with the other fabrics, maybe assess how your pieces fit together. Maybe go back, seam rip, and try to sew that strip again, this time using pins. If you're pinning everything together and it is aligned prior to sewing, then it should be aligned after sewing as well. So really making sure that your pieces are not shifting as you are sewing them together. So when pinning quadrants together, I like to start with my first nesting seam. Then if I have this negative space, I'm going to pin that after I get this done. And I really want to make sure that my two pieces are square on top of each other. Not only make sure that this edge is aligned, but also this edge over here. So really making sure that all of my edges are aligned. So now I'm going to add pins going in this direction. And also going in this direction. So I started here. Now I'm going to come back with my glue and get my seams that are pressed open aligned. So then you're going to sew your top two quadrants together and your bottom two quadrants together. You are going to press those seams either open, or you can press them in the opposite direction to give you nesting seams. And then you will sew both of those units together, press that seam open, and then that will be the final seam of your quilt top. And you might decide that you want to backstitch these quadrant seams. You might decide that you want to stay stitch around the perimeter. This is just a seam that's about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and it secures all of your seams that are on the edge. Since we did strip piecing for these quadrants, it might be a good idea to go ahead and stay stitch around that perimeter, especially if you plan to like take it outside for quilt pictures or save it for later if you plan to quilt it at a later date. It might be a good idea just to go ahead and secure those seams. And after this step, you have officially completed your upscale plaid quilt. I am so excited to see how it turned out. Please share a photo on social media, tag us in the photo, and use the hashtag so that we all can see. This is the best part of making a quilt pattern together, is just seeing everyone's creativity, everyone's process throughout all of this. So I'm really, really excited to see. Don't forget to share. So speaking of sharing a photo, that brings us to our week 4 prize, and this prize is a really special one. It is a seat to one of our 3 online quilting classes. So Lo and behold, Stitchery, part of what we do is online education, and we have 3 different online quilting classes. We have Beginner Quilting Academy, Triangle School, and Curve College. If you have already taken one of these courses, then you can opt for a shop credit that you can use for patterns or kits, fabric bundles, notions, anything like that. But one lucky winner is going to win a seat in one of these courses, and you can choose. Beginner Quilting Academy is our very basic but super comprehensive beginner course. Basically takes you from 0 to quilting in 8 weeks, so no prior sewing knowledge is needed. If you've completed this quilt along, you may decide that you want to go back and take Beginner Quilting Academy, but odds are you already know the basics of quilting. But it does give you a really good foundation of terminology and supplies, even how to use your sewing machine. We also cover quilting, basting, binding, those kinds of topics. So truly making the quilt from start to finish, even how to choose fabrics for your quilt, things like that. So that's Beginner Quilting Academy. Then we have Triangle School. That is a step above Beginner Quilting Academy, and it is our advanced beginner, almost intermediate course. So it really takes your piecing skills up a notch. We focus on triangles, so traditionally pieced triangles, how to trim them, cut them, different things like efficiency tips, and also just general sewing tips, pressing tips, all of those things. It really is a great comprehensive course. It's kind of the next level to Beginner Quilting Academy, and it's 10 weeks, and we cover a lot of ground in Triangle School. And then after that is Curve College. So these are all 3 different courses. Curve College is our intermediate course, and we specifically focus on curves. There are 3 different kinds of traditionally pieced curves. We talk about cutting, piecing, trimming, tips for working with bias edges, all of those things. I do want to mention that all 3 courses are comprehensive, so we make the entire quilt from start to finish in all 3 courses. And in each one, the difficulty level gets a little bit harder and a little bit harder, a little bit more complex. You can go at your own pace. It's lifetime access, and we really are just so proud of these courses, and we love coming alongside the students and just going through this process together. So all of that to say, enrollment opens for our courses only a couple times a year, and enrollment is coming up soon. So be on the lookout for that. Spring 2024, it's going to open for enrollment. But one lucky winner from this quilt along is going to win a seat in a course of their choice. Again, if you have already taken all 3 courses, which I know many of you have, then that can be transferred to a shop credit in our shop. So in order to enter, you are going to share a photo of your finished quilt top. It does not need to be quilted. We just want to see the top. And you are, just like the other weeks, going to tag Lo and Behold Stitchery in the photo and use the hashtags Upscale Plaid QAL, Upscale Plaid Quilt, and Lo and Behold Patterns. And we are going to give you a deadline of March 1st at midnight. So you want to get your entries in before March 1st, and then the winner is going to be announced in the March 2nd newsletter that goes out that following day on a Saturday. So I cannot wait to see those beautiful entries. If you have been following along live, and even if you are participating in this quilt along after the fact, after we have officially ended, I just want to say thank you so much for choosing this pattern. Thank you for choosing Lo and Behold Stitchery. We are so grateful for your support, and I hope that you have enjoyed this pattern as much as I enjoy making it. Sewing along with you all and making a quilt together is one of my favorite things in the world, so thank you for just allowing me to do this and for making it possible. If you do not already follow us on social media, be sure to find us for Lo and Behold Stitchery on all of the platforms, and say hello and follow along and get a little bit of behind the scenes. And also be sure to sign up for our newsletter. That is the best way to stay in touch. We send one newsletter every week, and we share all sorts of things, different tutorials, new patterns, new courses, things that we're working on behind the scenes, different inspirational things. So it's a lot of fun. Make sure that you stay in touch via the newsletter. And otherwise, thank you again for following along. This has been so super fun. I cannot wait to do it again. And until next time, bye for now.